Justin Marceau is a professor of law and the Brooks Institute Faculty Research Scholar of Animal Law and Policy at Denver Sturm College of Law, where he's also the faculty director of the Animal Law program there. Professor Marceau is the recipient of numerous awards, including the Justice for Animals Award and the Colorado Criminal Defense Bar's Gideon Award. He's furthermore a member of the American Law Institute, and he was a visiting professor at Harvard Law School in 2020 and UC Irvine in 2021. In addition, Justin Marceau works on several projects and initiatives with the Brooks Institute for Animal Rights, Law and Policy. His research focuses on criminal law, animal law, constitutional law, in particular with a focus on social change. He's the author of more than 40 law review articles, as well as 2 textbooks. His first book, Beyond Cages, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2019. And last year, as many of you will know, he and Laurie Gruen published the co-edited volume, Carceral Logics, which they launched in the Talking Animals Law and Philosophy series. In his keynote address today, Justin Marceau will be talking to us about glass walls and animal protection messaging. Thank you very much for being with us today. The floor is yours, Justin.
Thanks for having me. Well, thanks for having me. It's a very nice introduction. I thought I was feeling a bit sort of sluggish, so I thought this inquisitive sheep was a nice way to start. But thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here at the Cambridge Center. Just a few years ago, you really would not have, I didn't know of it. And so it's a testament to Sean and Raphael and the others working here, how much they've accomplished. I would say, the number of things you're aiming to do is nothing short of ambitious. So kudos to that. I also wanted to thank Tim and Sarah and Amanda in the back from the Brooks Institute. Just in the last several years, for those of you who haven't gotten to meet them, they've really changed the face of animal law in the US and in North America more generally. And so it's always a pleasure to be with them. So I'm going to talk about, as Raphael said, glass walls. I'm going to start just by sort of saying a couple of things about my background. So I grew up, maybe in a place like this, but I grew up around cows a lot. I grew up in the state of Montana, which for those of you that don't know is a rural state where cows and corn are sort of sacred anchors of the agrarian economy. And I frequently joined one or more of my relatives to feed a cow, spend a day with a sheep. And it was, I have very fond memories of it. And one of the memories that I've come back to a number of times since I've been a law professor was a morning when a calf was born. And for reasons that I don't remember, and I haven't gone back and asked people why, the calf was named Lucifer. So I don't know what was going on there, but the calf was named Lucifer. And Lucifer and I had a particular bond, and I can still remember feeding Lucifer corn husks and sort of the wet nose and the tongue. And then I remember that one night I sat down for dinner at my grandparents' house, and I said, what's for dinner, like every small kid? And my grandfather said, Lucifer. And at the time, I didn't have the wherewithal or the insight or the courage or whatever I was missing to think much about it. It was something that bothered me, and it stuck with me. But the reason I tell that story today is that if there was an animal that had the experience of the sort of one bad day phenomena, this idea that the animal lives and then just we give it life and sort of almost contractually at the end has one bad day and we get to eat it. It was something like Lucifer, because he's running around, playing, kicking balls. It seemed to me like having a very good cow life. And it's this image, I think, of sort of green fields in Montana, literally rivers and hills. It's like the river runs through it. Beautiful ranch that many people have in mind when they think about the burger they're about to consume or the other meat that they're going to eat. So if there ever was just sort of the one bad day, it was something like this farm that I was on. But as we now know, right, that's not what agriculture in the modern world looks like. And it's not just one bad day. In the US, it's now estimated that north of 99% of all food animals come from factory farms. The number is much better, it seems, in the United Kingdom, but still above 70%, and globally around 90%. And what this means is that there's all kinds of practices, as you all know, that have been normalized and sort of made part of the process of producing animals for food. And so what we often say, we have a number of, I think, reactions and anecdotes and sort of just temptations to our moral upheaval when we're struggling with how people can do this. You know, one of the sayings that comes out is this, if slaughterhouses had glass walls, we would all be vegetarian, right? And there's this sort of assurance that if we just knew more, we would do better. If we knew more about these animals, we saw how they were living, and we knew how smart they were, we would suddenly change course. We'd do something a little bit different, a little bit better. And that's actually what I want to talk about today. I want to dive a little deeper into this impulse that more information will help us, that more information and transparency is really what we're lacking. It's a lack of knowledge. And I'm going to do so by talking about both some social psychology research that others have done and that I'm starting to do, and some research that I've done regarding investigations. So first of all, I thought it would be helpful just to sort of posit this idea of what would a modern day glass wall look like if we were convinced that slaughterhouses would go down in size or change practices, or that we would eat fewer animals if they had glass walls. What would that even mean in a practical sense? And we no longer live up in Sinclair's era where the slaughterhouses were right at the periphery, right? For many of us, the slaughterhouses are quite far from where we live. They're not in our neighborhoods. We don't walk by them on the way to school. They're much more of a marginalized community. Sometimes they make a community, a whole boom town. And animals, of course, now are born, they're raised, they're often slaughtered indoors on private property. It's not something that we're seeing and we're exposed to. And the scale of these is also quite different than it was at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, right? Timothy Pascherot has written about the fact that we don't even have glass walls within a slaughterhouse, right? Within a particular slaughterhouse, if you are a worker in one part of the slaughterhouse, you probably aren't allowed to see what's happening in another part. There's not even communication within that slaughterhouse. And the scale is massive, right? We may be killing large land mammals every 12 seconds. And so you say, well, how would we possibly get a view of this, right? Many times an employee can't even have a whole view. And so, there's different things, right? One of the things that has come up repeatedly, it came up just a few months ago when I was speaking to a sustainability council, and there was a rancher from a farmer's market, a local rancher. But it came up more pointedly for me, this idea of tours. After an animal justice investigation from Canada came out a couple of years ago, they had exposed some pretty terrible cow abuse and made national news. It was on sort of the national news program for the country. And one of the responses was to have a dairy spokesman on. And she said, if ever anyone feels like the meat or the dairy that they're getting is had a bad life, I encourage you to just come and take a tour. Like, tours are part of our business. Like, we want you to know that the animals are treated well. And it really stuck with me. I said, wow, that's interesting. Like, I've been litigating ag laws for years, but we just get tours. This is interesting, right? It was promised on TV. And so, like anyone academic with too much time, I just hired my research assistants to call every large industrial farming operation slaughterhouse in my state. And then we made phone lists of the 4 neighboring states, all of which are quite agricultural. And I won't bore you with all the details because it turned out to not be so, it's not really the sort of thing that you could publish. But imagine having called dozens of slaughterhouses and feedlots and say, look, I was trying to get a tour. And they say, well, who are you? And you say, well, we're a law school, but we have an animal law club, and we're interested in coming for a tour. And they said, well, do you want to buy meat? No. I mean, we could have lied, right? This is how investing. We could have said, well, we're kind of interested. Are you doing, particular research on husbandry methods? Well, we're interested in them. It's not a research project. We just would like to witness what's going on. And they said, every one of them said, well, we'll get back to you. And we'll get back to you. But maybe not a surprise to anyone in this room. None of them got back to us. With one exception, actually. That's not true. One got back and said, we're willing to welcome you. And they said they had a set date. And I said, okay. And it turned out it was the smallest slaughterhouse in the state, but it was still something. But that morning when we were preparing to drive, they called. It was great because it was a 5-hour drive. And so we were all piling into a van. And they said, by the way, no cameras, no phones, no recording devices. And I said, oh, well, I mean, okay, I guess we can do that, but that changes the game a little bit. And I said, so we're allowed to see everything that's happening, but we just can't record or take images. And they said, well, there's nothing happening today. We only slaughter 2 days a week. We're a small operation, so you could just come and see. Like yesterday was our cleanup day, and you could come and see today. And so the one operation out of literally dozens that had invited us for a tour, and we sort of documented this, but I haven't written it up and published it, but I think we followed up with each slaughterhouse 3 or 4 times, sort of say, could we possibly get in? So tours are not realistic. You all could speak more realistically about the prospects for closed caption TV, right, which is something that is happening here in Europe. I still have high hopes for it, and I think that many groups in the U.S. aspire and say, look, what we need is CCTV running all the time in these operations. My understanding of the way that it works in England is that it only goes to sort of government animal welfare agents, and we're not sort of seeing it in the public, so it's not the sort of true glass walls. I think that Belgium and the Netherlands have industry-imposed recordings of what's happening in the slaughterhouse, but it's still a quite finite universe, right? It's a very limited exposure, who gets to see it, when it might start, for example, in Spain. And so I don't want to put too much weight on that now. And to the best of my knowledge, I did a pretty careful review so far. Raphael, you can correct me, but I have not seen any research on public reactions to CCTV footage, if there's been any in Europe. So I tried pretty hard to see it. I don't think that there's been any use of it in a major public campaign, but if I'm mistaken, I would like to look at it. And if it has, I think it's been small and it hasn't been written up yet. So if it's not going to be those two, then of course it sort of brings us back to the beginning, and in some sense the obvious, which is investigations. And for my purposes, by investigations, I mean things that probably involve some conduct that many of us would find unsavory, right? Like a lie, or a misrepresentation, or an omission, or recording without some overt consent to that recording. And these, this is a practice, again, it's not unique to animals, right? So we could just sort of debate the morality or things like that. I'm going to talk about the sort of feasibility and practicality of it, but we could debate the morality of it. But if you wanted to see what was going on, I don't think too many advocates dispute the fact that you're going to need some level of investigation, some efforts to create transparency. And this is something that has happened in all kinds of fields, right? It crosses political boundaries without question. We've had Christian missionaries doing undercover investigations in human trafficking with effects of people being released. We've had government agents infiltrating everything from animal rights groups to terrorist cells. There are famous cases in the US of journalists being sort of admitted, lying about their condition, to be admitted to mental hospitals to write up the reports on it, into private prisons. There's been exposés of veteran fraud, welfare fraud. I mean, you name it, right? And of course, for our purposes, right, some of the most important developments in US law, and I would say globally, when I think about just transparency in general, have come from some footage, something that has stirred public emotion, and then yielded either, for example, in California, a law about what we should do with downed animals or the like, right? So investigations have this potential, but one of the things that I wanted to study was, well, if we are sure or feel somewhat confident that glass walls are important and investigations are a modern mechanism of glass walls, then does it matter who does them, right? There's one of the other truths that we hold, I think, as a movement, is that activists or partisans will be believed less. Or maybe we care who's even reporting on the message, right? Does it make a difference if we can get it in The Guardian versus the New York Times versus Fox News, right? Why would it matter, and does that change how the public perceives it? And so there's a few different things that we've looked at here in terms of what should be the source of the message and who could do these investigations. So the first question of who is a reliable sort of conveyor of information is one that I think all social movements struggle with. The conventional wisdom in the US, at least, I don't know, I'd like to hear if that's true in Europe. The conventional wisdom in the US has always been that veterinarians are sort of the sacred messengers, that everyone trusts a veterinarian. I don't know if that's quite as true. That my sense, even though some public opinion polling has taken a hit after some recent exposés and ventilation shutdown and the like, where animals were killed under veterinary supervision. But veterinarians are one of these messengers. But as between a large group of people, you can say, well, who would we want to carry our message? And so two people that I'm working with, Janice Nadler and David Dana, have done some messaging studies on the output side. We're doing some other studies now, but I'll tell you about one that they did, which I think is quite important and hasn't gotten attention in the movement that I think it deserves. So what Janice and David studied is this instinct that who we would really listen to would be perhaps authorities on the topic. For example, an expert witness like a veterinarian, or maybe would it be an activist who has a particularly passionate message, or would it be the government, or would it be some sort of private entity? And so one plausible theory was that if corporations spoke about these issues or took a position, then maybe that would fill the public void. It would make it so there was less interest in government regulation or government action. So if you had McDonald's saying we don't need government regulation because we have already done this, maybe that would be persuasive to the public. But what they did is they studied a number of different messengers on a single topic. And the topic was this idea of cage-free eggs. So McDonald's in the US said, we're no longer going to serve any cage-free eggs. We're going to stop serving them. Whether they do or they don't, it's a separate matter, right? There's been lots of problems with compliance with these corporate campaigns, but they said, we're not going to serve cage-free eggs in our restaurants anymore. Well, David and Janice gave basically their statement of that announcement to a number of people and contrasted it with similar statements from other people, including states, right? Some states said, their leading authorities in the state said, we should cut down on battery cage use in our state. And so when people were given the message from different entities, it turns out that they trust most the message when it comes from a corporation. Now, this hasn't been studied yet. This is one of the reasons I want to talk about here in Europe. And there is this idea that Americans are particularly fascinated with what corporations think, and that sort of corporations hold a particularly high status in the US in this sort of like idealized, mythologized free market. But the results are still quite surprising, because what it showed was that more than other actors in the market, if you have a corporation come forward and say, we think this is bad, not only do people listen to that and say, wow, that must be bad, but they also think there should be laws regulating. So it's not that they stop and just trust the corporation. They are more supportive of regulations if the corporation itself says, this thing here, we're not going to do it anymore, or we think there are problems with this practice, which I think is counterintuitive for a lot of us who think that we are at war with corporations. In many ways we are, but if their messaging changes even a slight degree, it turns out that the public, at least when it comes to this it's a very nascent body of research. Social scientists have not done much. And we're looking at doing some in Europe as well. But then in the US, that is going to be a major driver of public opinion. So Nadler and Dana were looking at who would be a good messenger, but in some ways the antecedent question is, well, how do you get the information? Like, how do you tell people about what's happening in battery cages? How do you tell people what's happening in pig confinement? How do we even show the public what is at issue? And if we're going to do that through investigations, as I argued is probably one of the ways that many groups are still going to fall back to, does it matter then who did the investigations, right? And my working hypothesis going into these research was that people would give a major discount to investigations that were either against their own political interest, so about a cause that they took issue with, or were done by an entity that they viewed as a political enemy, right? So I'll explain what I mean by that. But I set out to study the credibility and the degree placed on undercover investigations through a series of experiments. And I'll tell you just some of the highlights of these findings, because to the best of my knowledge, we have not seen any of this. I mean, we've always gone by kind of anecdote on this. We have not had any hard data. The first thing that I found was that there is overwhelming support for undercover investigations, right? That the baseline support for an investigator, and to be very clear, I didn't make a slide that shows what the prompt was, but I'd be happy to share it. The prompt is a not very flattering description. Everyone got the same prompt of an undercover investigation is, right? This is sort of a best practice in a social science experiment. I think we had a very clear definition. So it wasn't just a random public opinion poll, like a Gallup poll that says, do you like undercover investigations? People had a very clear definition of undercover investigations. That will often include lying, might include deception, might include recording people without their consent. People overwhelmingly supported this. And at such levels and across the partisan divide in ways, it was surprising to me, given the rise of laws, not just in the US, but in Canada and in Australia, targeting undercover investigations. Sort of surprising. But beyond that, right, the second thing that I studied, after sort of looking for just baseline support, which was high, I looked at who did the investigation, and would that matter? Would we care who the entity was that did the investigation? And again, sort of surprising results for me, because what we found is that essentially, and this is across party lines, and you can see, I mean, some of the minutia is in the footnote there. I'm not going to walk through it. I mean, some of these are statistically significant, some of them are not, but as trend lines, they're quite important to look at. What we found is basically for any investigative entity, one that was associated with the left, and we vetted that in a separate project. The New York Times is considered to be left. Fox was considered right, and then a non-profit neutral. We said just a neutral news acquiring organization. For both the New York Times and any sort of neutral entity, from the baseline, support for undercover investigations at the highest level, very important for revealing truth. If you put together very important and somewhat important as the two metrics, it's always over 90%. But if you have very important, this is where the differences come in. You see the New York Times by Republicans and Democrats is trusted more. Fox stays the same. It doesn't drop off. So even Democrats who might say, oh, I can't stand Fox News, they still would treat at least as valuable as just hearing about investigations in general to learn that Fox News did an investigation. And if it comes from a neutral nonprofit, support is also quite high. I think this is a surprising discovery, because the prior research has all assumed, without studying, that you will only see increases in support for any investigative journalistic tactic if the entity doing it is one that is aligned with you. So this is a bit of a jolt, but I wanted to say a couple other things that I think are even more surprising. First of all, one of the things that I did was query whether one's appetite for an investigation might vary depending on their political party. So are we more friendly, and it looks like I may have left that slide out, but are we more friendly to investigations if they reveal dirt on our enemies? So basically, to test this, we sort of gave people the idea that there could be an investigation of someone of their own political party, Democrat, Republican, this was all in the US, or an independent, or it can be an investigation of somebody in the other party, right? So random sample of people are given, they tell their own demographics, and it turns out that contrary to the hypothesis, support for undercover investigations doesn't vary dramatically, even if it is an investigation against your own party or your own self-interest. So there is some slight in-group preference, and it turns out it was a little bit stronger for conservatives, but it was not at all what you would have imagined. It turns out that people have a general preference for transparency across party lines. It's much more of a neutral, apolitical goal than people think. A Democrat learning that their favorite candidate, I mean, these were anonymous, they weren't named candidates, but a prominent, it was described as a rising star, is involved in some corruption through an undercover investigation by an employment intern, thinks that that's very important to find out. And likewise, so does a Republican overall. The Democrat has a slight preference for an investigation of a Republican. They would say that. And the Republican has a slight preference for an investigation of a Democrat. But it's not what we would have assumed. It's certainly not what I would have assumed. All right? And I think that is something to account for when we start to think about glass walls. But this brings me to perhaps two of my most interesting findings. And that is, does our opinion of investigations change if it starts to be on topics that are sensitive to us? So maybe we trust an investigation even if it happens to be close to what we might think of as a political ally. But what if we take it out of politics and bring it straight into politicized issues? And so I looked at investigations, very similar fact patterns, which I'd be happy to share, but that were human trafficking, political corruption, dogfighting, farmed animal cruelty, and abortion. And so the core fact pattern was basically identical for each. An investigator did the same thing, infiltrated, found some unsavory practices. And the first thing I will say is that across parties, there was, as a general matter, strong support for investigations in all the categories. So there was support for undercover investigations across these categories. But what this table shows is that there's one standout that is kind of interesting, and not at all what I would have expected, right? If the respondent is a Democrat versus, so if the respondent is a Democrat, you can see that their base level support for thinking undercover investigations are very important is about 51%. That jumps to 67% if they are told that the investigation is of factory farm cruelty and given a specific example. For independents, it jumps from 51% to 65%. So the baseline is about the same, and the jump is nearly identical, no statistical difference. For Republicans, persons who identify as such, the baseline support for undercover investigations is a touch lower, as you see, and there is no statistically significant difference between looking at farm animals. So in other words, there was an increase in support among all groups for all types of investigations. The only exception across all of these permutations was persons who identified as conservative when there was an investigation of farmed animal cruelty. Their opinion of investigations stayed the same. Again, it didn't go down, right? You might think that people would say, well, we're going to trust investigators less. This is factory farms. This is what we do. And so a final point here is that the one category where Democratic support and Republican support did go down was for abortions. So an investigation of abortions, but this is a particularly fraught time for that in the US, but investigations of abortion providing facilities saw support for undercover investigations drop among Republicans and Democrats, interestingly. But otherwise, people of all different political stripes, quite robust samples, were in lockstep. Other than for abortion, they were also in step, but they dropped. And then farm animals, there was some differentiation. The only other thing I want to say about this is the existing research, and quite relevant to people who do animal activism, suggests, and I say suggests because it's never been studied, suggests quite strongly that if you have political bias, and the way that researchers have tended to label that is particularly a financial interest. If you have a financial interest in an investigation, then nobody is going to believe it. It's not going to be taken as credible. And I had taken that as a working assumption in the early instruments that I was drafting for this research as well. And perhaps most surprisingly, it turns out that that is largely incorrect. So I did an experiment with the same fact patterns as before, that is looking at abortion, dogfighting, animal cruelty on a farm, human or sex trafficking. But the only difference was that it wasn't just a neutral or a non-independent doing the investigation. It was a partisan organization. And the fact pattern would say this organization stands to gain a lot of publicity. They're probably going to get donations because of this campaign. And it's possible that criminal charges could be laid against the investigative target, right? So you have negative outcomes for the investigative person, which could make them feel sympathy with them. You have really favorable potential outcomes for the investigative group, which is, they're going to get donors. Or they were said to be, their notoriety would rise. And what's striking here is, and this is a really robust set of data, and as you can see, most of it is statistically significant. The motivation of an investigator, financial or otherwise, didn't really change the game. People didn't care very much that the investigation came from someone with a political orientation. And in some ways, this is a pretty key finding because I would have thought going into the research that you had to have an intermediary that kind of laundered the message, that you had transparency, and then you had to figure out who was the messenger. But it turns out that if the message is powerful and people think that it is, convincing, because these are just words, right? I'm not showing them actual images. People will say it doesn't really matter very much to them. And you can see this going across, right? I mean, baseline support, again, for each of these things. I did it by party. The numbers look quite similar if you don't do it by party, but even for politically motivated, financially relevant investigators, the only thing we see a drop for is abortion investigations. And again, that's a little bit loaded because we have groups like in the US doing investigations of Planned Parenthood that are being rightly or wrongly quite demonized. And so it has a different, I think, media valence. It shows in some sense that the people were paying attention. I think this tracks. But otherwise, right, it largely goes up from the baseline for each of these things. So then that brings me to this question of, this one is a little bit more granular. I'm happy to talk about it in questions. But so then if investigations could work, why don't we do more of them? And there's lots of reasons for that. I'm not going to go through all the logistical, although I've been talking to a number of groups about it. But, the obvious is that investigations are costly, they're time consuming, they involve lots of legal risks, including you sometimes have investigators charged with crimes of animal cruelty. So it's a big ordeal. It's also the case that I would say quite alarmingly, the rise of contracts that require secrecy threaten to impede the ability to have any glass walls. So just within the last month, Planned Parenthood in the US won a lawsuit against the Center for Medical Progress, which is one of these groups that has been doing investigations of their proceedings, conferences and the like. And essentially the Ninth Circuit, a federal court of appeals in the US, said by signing a contract upon entry into their conference, anything that this person saw, they recorded, that they documented, could not be released upon risk of jail for contempt. And they appealed that, and the Ninth Circuit upheld it. The federal court of appeals upheld it. So in a sense, right, if I was working for the industry right now, I wouldn't care very much at all about ag gag laws. Right? I've been doing ag gag laws. I'll mention them in a second. But there's a lot of smoke and fury around ag gag laws at the moment. But the reality is, if other countries follow this model, all you need to do is have a well-written employment contract that says you can't do anything. Anything you do is under lock and key upon risk of civil contempt. It's much more powerful than ag gag laws, and it wouldn't be hard for a trade group to come up with such a contract. Right? But there are ag gag laws, and I'm happy to take questions about them. They came out in the U.S. Directly, so we didn't know much about the impact of investigations, but industry had certainly assumed that they were a powerful weapon of activists. So these laws came out. The laws specifically criminalize things like using deceptions to gain access, and that feature of the laws spread almost verbatim from Iowa across the border to Canada, where Alberta and Ontario have provisions that look very similar. Australia also has some provisions that, while different, also target that kind of conduct. And just a few years ago, Will Potter was in Australia speaking to the legislature about the harms of ag gag laws. So these were a real risk, right? These were something that I think many of us focused on as believers in transparency, that were going to cause harms if we didn't strike them down. And so we spent a lot of energy. We've had a lot of success on them. And so part of my research was aimed at, is this to a good end? Well, where I want to end and take questions is, so if we imagine that glass walls or transparency is important, and we could come to the conclusion that there are good messengers and bad messengers in charge of the public, but that becomes less important when it's about transparency, because if you actually have something that you're exposing, whether it's animals or dogfighting or farm or human trafficking, the public is generally going to support you across party lines. Then okay, then we're most of the way there, right? But the last piece is understanding, well, what if we do show the public these things? Is everything going to change if we're able to get this information and we're able to get it through the right sources? Then will things change? And as many of you probably know, there's a team of UK scholars whose work is new, but is quite influential, and that I follow, and that they do work, including Steve Laughlin, on what's called the meat paradox. And this is a term used to describe the cognitive dissonance, right, around meat. So basically, the feeling that we love animals, but the dissonance of, but we eat them. And so you say, well, what do we do with that dissonance? And that's what the meat paradox research is about. This sort of vexing problem of people saying, I love animals, but I just need to have a pork sandwich. So a couple of highlights from the research. One is that there is a need for the person to be triggered. You need a triggering event, is what the social scientists call it, in order to have dissonance. And so what is a triggering event for dissonance? Well, it could be an image, it could be a commercial, could be a billboard, could be any number of things, right? And I think some of you in the room have used campaigns on fur and other things. Maybe they've been quite successful. But this has relevance to transparency work because what researchers have found is that a number of people will avoid those triggers, right? They will work, slavishly to avoid being triggered, to being reminded of what's in their sandwich or where their sandwich came from. And so there are a number of people who want to know as little as possible. And so if they see that headline, they see that news story, they see that billboard, they will actually look away. They won't go to the website. They will actively avoid it. And so one of the dominant ways that the researchers have found that people deal with their meat paradox is to go within their shell, right? And again, this is consistent with a social media world and internet world where we can sort of just go within our enclaves and not be exposed, right? There's not one authoritative figure. We don't have these, and in the US, we don't even have sort of like law review commissions and things like that. So there might be glass walls, but if everyone's looking away, then maybe it doesn't matter too much, right? And another thing that the research teaches us is that those people who are triggered are very good at adapting excuses. And the primary excuse that social scientists find is that they talk about the sentience and intelligence of the animals. So they say, well, yeah, that does look horrible. And it turns out that for conservatives, the things that are particularly triggering are things that look dirty, things that look unhealthy, things that look unnatural as a term. But what they end up saying is, but they're unintelligent. And the quote that the researchers use that they came across in some variation over and over again is, they're, quote, too unintelligent to understand what's really happening to them. So this second feature of cognitive dissonance then sounds promising, right? Because if what people are saying is, sometimes I'm exposed to this, but I'm able to convince myself that animals just aren't feeling enough or aren't intelligent enough, then maybe we can solve that problem, right? Surely we can infiltrate and teach the world that the animals are smarter. But unfortunately, there's not a lot of great news on this front either, because it seems that exposure to clear and unquestioned science doesn't always or even very often change the minds of people. And so I'll give you one example from the leading research on this. And here, Janice and David and I are actually doing a series of follow-up studies. Others who are interested, I would really encourage you to do so. The meat paradox research, I think, is really key to understanding where law and policy is going to go and where our levers are. And the research is very, very new. But one of the studies that I wanted to just quickly tell you about before I close, it's a paper that I make all my law students read. It's from 2016, and it's by this guy I mentioned, Steve Laughlin, but also Jared Piazza, and it's called When Meat Gets Personal. So it is a series of really brilliant things that they publish in this paper, When Meat Gets Personal. And the first is they said, well, do people actually change their minds about the value of animals? Do they think they deserve legal protection based on intelligence? And they said, we think they do, but we should test it. And so how do you test that? Well, they came up with a fictional animal on another planet. I think that was called like a Trogloaf or something. And they said, here are the traits of a Trogloaf. And they varied it between high and low intelligence. I think in one of them they had a medium intelligence too. And so this high and low intelligence of a fictional creature that you've never met, you've never heard of, and in fact, you know that it's on another planet, and so it just doesn't really seem like it would be real. People responding to that overwhelmingly, I mean, it's not close, say, the high intelligent Trogloaf deserves protection, right? I mean, they are really sympathetic to it. I mean, there's even, they are quite captured by this image of an alien creature, and like, wow, it could do that. It's as smart as a 5-year-old. It plays video games. It has memory. It recognizes faces. This is amazing. It turns out that one of the things they used to describe the Trogloaf was just from the Humane Society's website describing pigs. But it was so powerful to people that they were having a really strong moral reaction. They wanted laws. They thought that the animal shouldn't be hunted. It shouldn't be consumed. And the second thing they did, so that really confirmed that science and knowledge about sentience and intelligence could move the needle. Right? It really can. But then the second study had, well, what if we put it in a realm that was a little more familiar, not just an alien creature? So there was a Trogloaf, again, an alien animal. There was a tapir, which, so far as I know, no one in North America eats. I don't know if they do in Europe, but they do apparently in Asia, and they're starting to be farmed. And a pig. And they gave them, again, varying, high intelligence, low intelligence across a large group. And what do you think happened? Well, much to the chagrin of all of us who want to figure out pathways to help animals, it turns out that intelligence mattered a lot still for the alien creature, and it mattered a lot for the tapir that no one reported eating, and it mattered not at all for the pig. And they all had identical descriptions, right? People would read these fact patterns about an animal, same description for each animal, but when they're told that it's a pig, they say, yeah, I don't think pigs deserve any protection. In fact, it's so strong that a low intelligence pig, a low intelligence and a high intelligence pig, there's not really any difference. Like if you tell somebody that a pig is dumb, they treat it the same as a high intelligence pig. And a high intelligence pig is treated as deserving of less legal protection than a low intelligence tapir or a low intelligence alien creature, right? And so this is quite concerning, because if it was in fact the case that glass walls were going to save us or even be a significant part of the metric, then we would come to understand that when people saw more and learned about these animals, they would change. But in fact, when people learn about them, they tend to dig in. And they had stronger feelings about pigs after that. And I should say, in these studies, vegetarians and vegans were screened out, right? Because they didn't want people to say that, about pigs. These were all people who had at least potentially eaten pork as part of their diet. And so what this tells us is that intelligence, potentially science in general about intelligence, is extremely relevant to people, but only until it becomes personally relevant to them, right? So if it conflicts with what they're already doing, unfortunately, it seems to not have a lot of effect. Again, this is a new area of research, and we could find gaps, we could find little ways to tweak that might be, but I think that that's pretty important. And so I'll close on a slightly more upbeat note, because I don't think there's a lot of good news here, but I don't want to be just sort of hopeless about it all. I started with the quote that if slaughterhouses had glass walls, we would all be vegetarian. And I think my research suggests that investigations are trusted, or even beloved, or viewed by some people in qualitative samples as kind of the soul of a functioning democracy. There's lots of glowing things about them. But it's probably not the case that transparency is going to create a watershed moment. Even transparency accompanied by pretty impressive science. You're going to have some sort of fluke. So, but I would say, and I argue with who I mentioned before, Timothy Pastoral, about this all the time, facts still matter. And what I mean by that is we need stubborn truths in order to do anything in law and policy or activism. We're not going to prevail in battles to help animals unless we have sort of some on-the-ground truth. And so I'll end just with this quote from Hannah Arendt, which I think puts it really, really well. She says, "Unwelcome opinion can be argued with, rejected, or compromised upon, but unwelcome facts possess an infuriating stubbornness that nothing can move except plain lies." And that's really what I think here, right? Is that we can't expect too much from the investigations, but knowing how pigs live, for example, in a gestation crate, then makes that at least a stubborn truth. They could lie about it. They could lie about how fur is produced. They could lie about how eggs are raised. We get eggs. But even if it's not going to create a watershed moment, those facts are still highly relevant to the sort of contested debates that are going to keep coming up, right? And so at the end of the day, we're going to need more research on all these social science questions, but I'm not giving up yet. So thank you, and I'm happy for your questions and comments.